So yeah, let's get started. So I wanted to talk about sort of, I think a pretty big insight I feel like that I've really digested myself only after the last year or two. I wrote this post that I think you guys were talking about, a Wired article. Was that the Wired article about Gumroad and me, I guess?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
fine.
so like I think there's the post linked in that reflecting on my failure to build $1 billion company sort of like started me on this kind of like new journey. It was meant to be the end of sort of like my reflections on Gumroad, which is why I sort of titled it as such. But it actually kind of opened up the door to like really kind of examining like, things I could have done differently, or like how I would recommend people sort of build a business, differently than maybe I went into it, which was like to kind of, raise a bunch of money and sort of figure it out along the way, and kind of sort of the cargo cult of Silicon Valley. So anyways, the big insight I think is sort of just the order of operations. So let me just go really quickly through Gumroad's past before I sort of get to that exactly. So just for some sort of like credibility's sake, this is Gumroad's volume since the beginning, effectively. So 2011, I started the company. Ended up raising around $8 million from sort of the Silicon Valley VC angel ilk, Chris Sacca, Ron Conway, first round, Kleiner Perkins, all the sort of known quantities. And if you like really like, so a third of the way through is when I had to do the layoffs, right? So this is a long time. This is like 9 years compressed into a single chart. But if you're growing at the rate that we were growing sort of 3 years in, it's just not good enough to kind of keep going on the sort of venture back path. What should have happened, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it should have been more like this, is what maybe would have led to sort of a venture back outcome. So it's just hard. It's like pretty rare to really get to that. It just doesn't happen too often. And then coronavirus happened. So we started seeing this like crazy spike in volume and people joining the platform, adding products. Everyone's looking for ways to make money while they're at home. A lot of creative people have sort of been furloughed or have lost jobs or workshop opportunities or whatever they were doing before. So it's kind of interesting because Gumroad, like the whole point of the post was like, it is what it is. I built this business. It didn't reach sort of this mega scale, but it did reach some scale, and that's fine. And now coronavirus is kind of like actually put us back on this kind of J curve again, which I'm still kind of like wrestling with. And it kind of dovetails a little bit into like one of the major points of what I wrote, which is it doesn't really matter how awesome you are, how great your team is, how fast you're shipping. Ultimately, the market you're in is going to determine like the vast majority of your growth, right? And so like if you can look at this chart, for example, like it was like pushing a boulder up a hill. Like there's only so much you can do. And then an earthquake happened or something, right? Like there's just these macro forces that are just so much larger than anything a small team of people could really do. And I think that's kind of a misconception in Silicon Valley often, is that people really believe they can change consumer behavior and sort of like, just change the world with an invention. And I just don't really buy that. I think history actually shows, like, I feel like over and over again, that it's actually quite rare that it's a single person or a single team's sort of like set of ideas that really changes things dramatically. It's often like a collective set of people, and it takes a long time, and there's all this stuff that came before it that you don't really, it's just kind of ignored in the story and all of these kind of things. But anyways, that's sort of the Gumroad of the present. The Gumroad of the future is we're launching a Patreon sort of competitor. So we're going to sort of bundle memberships into the product so everyone can sell memberships directly to their audience, and we'll kind of start competing in that space. I think that's one of the big things that we've learned over the last few years, is how important memberships are to creators. And so I think it's really important for us, if we want to support creators, which we do, to get into that market. And we'll see how that goes. I think this launches like in a month or two. And Gumroad started, so that's the Gumroad, sort of like all of the kind of like historical context. Gumroad started because I wanted to sell this icon. So if people aren't familiar, I've told this story a lot, so I apologize if you've heard this, but basically I was at home one Friday night, 2011. I was working at Pinterest at the time, and I was at home and I wanted to learn like photorealistic icon design. I think I had an idea for like a Mac app or something like that, and I wanted an icon. And so I just like messed around on, you know, the internet and try to like come up with this. And, you know, it took me, I think this took me like 4 hours or something like that. And I just felt like, you know, if I had access to this source file, you know, like before I started, it would have taken me an hour or 30 minutes or something like that, right? Like there was so much stuff I had to put together, and that kind of like gave me this idea of like, well, I now have this thing, right? And so I could save the next person a bunch of time. That's probably worth something. I have an audience on the internet, on Twitter and Dribble. I should probably try to sell this thing for like $1, let's say, right? And so I tried, I like Googled around, and I just effectively just couldn't find anything that allowed me to sell something really easily directly to my audience. You know, this is sort of pre-Stripe. You know, we were one of the first users of Stripe, and like, it was just early, you know, there was just not a lot of ways to do that. You needed to create like a website, or, you know, put yourself in a marketplace, like find the sort of like proper marketplace for your product, and that marketplace would kind of take a huge chunk of the revenue and all these kind of things. And I just thought that was weird. I thought like pretty clearly social media is going to sort of connect everybody, right? Creators directly to consumers, and a lot of these creators, like they might be famous, they might be very successful, but they still don't even have a website really, right? And so I thought there was just like this really large opportunity to kind of basically, I think at the time I was like the lemonade stand of the internet. Like how can we make it super, super easy to get started, sort of like lower the activation energy required, and sort of take it from there. But this is kind of the story that like, you know, there's the sort of the story that I kind of like tell people, and even the one that I told myself. And luckily I had a blog post, or like a little like thing that I wrote a long time ago, that I found when I was trying to do research around this sort of origin story and like what actually happened. And I found this little bit, so I'll just read it. I actually had the idea for Gumroad a long time ago, and this is sort of, I wrote this, I think, really like a few months after I built Gumroad. So like this is sort of like 2011 or so, or at least a couple of years ago. I was working on a Twitter client for the iPhone. It was free, and I wanted a way to make money from it without charging for the app itself. I decided I would try to sell the source code of the app on the marketing website. I tried to find a solution. I never found one after a few hours of searching, and gave up. And I actually like forgot about this. I sort of like had revised the Gumroad origin story so much that I, like over the last bunch of years, that I actually forgot like that I had the idea for Gumroad actually a little while ago. And I was trying to figure out like, okay, what, you know, a lot of people, they don't even start. I feel like that's like the biggest problem that people have is not starting. And I was really trying to figure out like what a lot changed, you know, from those couple years. You know, I like graduated high school. I moved to the US. I started working at Pinterest. I got more competent at a bunch of skills. But I think the biggest thing that really changed, that got me from like giving up to like, I'm going to build something to solve this problem for myself, is I think I had the community. I was, you know, a couple years ago before this, like I was in Singapore just making iPhone apps by myself. Wasn't connected to anybody. I think Twitter had just come out at the time. And so I had no one to really like sell it to, or no one to get feedback from, or any of these things, right? Whereas when I had the idea for Gumroad to sell the pencil icon, you know, I was in Silicon Valley. I was contributing on Hacker News, and I had a Twitter account with a few thousand followers and all of these things. And so I think that was really sort of like the crux of like what led me to be to the point where I felt like I could build Gumroad. And not only could I build Gumroad, but I would have a set of people that would benefit from it almost immediately. And I think that was like really, really, really powerful. And YC, they're sort of famous. I think YC sort of created this, or Paul Graham created this sort of phrase of make something people want, right? And this is like maybe like the most sort of like fundamental quote in Silicon Valley lore, right? Because it's like, if you don't do this, kind of going back to the market thing, like if you don't do this, nothing else really matters. Like you could have the most amazing internal documentation or like tech stack or whatever, and you know, it doesn't really matter if people don't actually want the thing that you're building. I feel like during COVID, this sort of like phrase has been refined to make something people need, because you really want to make something that people really, really need right now. Especially, you have a much higher odds of success, I think, if you do that. But I think that there's sort of like there's so much focus, and I think that might come from this sort of engineering culture of Silicon Valley on the something part. There's like you got to make something that people want, and there's not, in my opinion, there's really not enough emphasis on the people part, right? So for example, like I was living in Hollywood for a bit, trying to learn about filmmaking last year, back when you could move from city to city. Sorry for the garbage truck going around. In Hollywood, the number one thing they ask you about any project you work on is like, what is your demographic? You can't really make a piece of content without really knowing who this piece of content is for. And it was kind of shocking to me. And when I'm working on this book for Penguin Random House, and it was like the same thing. It was like, who is this for? Like, who is your audience? Who's going to read this book first? Who's going to want to tell other people about this book, etc. And it really kind of like, I really felt like, wow, I had been missing something for a long time. I was so focused on the thing that I was building, and versus actually the people that I wanted to serve and wanted to help. And I think people often, when they get into it, they think incredibly broadly about the people part. They're like, oh, this is a great movie, so like everyone would want to watch this movie. Or I have this app that lets me talk to my friends, and like everybody wants to do that. And I think the problem with that is you don't really identify like what's sort of uniquely specific about the way that you're solving the problem, right? And so I think it's really, really helpful to focus on the people part. And so I sort of call it community first, but effectively you want to find a group of people that have something in common, which sort of in my mind is the definition of community. And community nowadays, I feel like it's getting this new kind of like a resurgence in usage. But it's basically just like find a group of people that all know each other, that all hang out, where you can sort of show someone in this group something that's really useful, and that person is going to sort of like spread it around most of the group. And I started looking at this sort of the Gumroad story and seeing this play out over and over again, where we basically would be found by someone in a certain community, like 3D modeling or something like that. And within 3 months, we would go from, basically zero volume in the sort of like 3D modeling products, tutorials, education space, to $300,000 to $400,000 a month in volume, because it was just kind of like spreading through these communities. And I think there's this sort of like there's this kind of like avoiding networks sort of, I think, thing that should happen in San Francisco. I think there's this obsession with Twitter and these things like that, where you can see all this virality, right? And so you're like, I need to grow, and the best way to grow is on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or something like that, because these networks are massive. Everybody's on them. And if you go viral, you can get seen by millions and millions and millions of people, which is like the best thing. I think someone was talking about that even in the call before that. The problem with that is that's happening every day, all the time. And you're competing with politics, you're competing with news, you're competing with literally, it's a single feed, right? So you're competing with everything else. And no one really is there to get the problem that they have solved, right? They're there to like be entertained, or learn about something, or stay in touch with their friends. Like they don't really care about you. And so I think it's a much more sort of effective way to sort of pick a community. It's like, don't actually start with the product and the problem that you're trying to solve. Like start with the community. You're like really figure out who do I want to serve? Is that a good group of people? Like, do I really want to spend 10 years helping them? And then once you have this sort of community piece, then you can worry about, okay, like what problem do these people have that, I can solve for them because of sort of like the unique set of skills that I have. And then, and also the one that they probably pay for, which is often like the most painful problem that they have. And then from there you can build a product, and from there you can figure out like the sort of the business model. So I think this sort of like community, a lot of people call it audience first, sort of angle, I think is sort of the future of building businesses. Honestly, I think just like Gumroad sort of came from this idea that basically all of these people, all these creators are being directly connected to their consumers. I think that's going to sort of start to happen in all types of entrepreneurship. People are building their audiences super early. They're forming opinions. They're figuring out what they care about, who they care about. And so I sort of think this like community sort of, and then on the other sort of like side of things, I think the networks are just so massive that you need to find your community. Otherwise you just feel lost, right? It would be like walking into like Trafalgar Square or something like that and trying to like make friends or something like that. Like it's probably unlikely. You kind of want to find your sort of like peer group, and then move out from there. And I think the way you do that is to find is to avoid the networks and really focus on the sort of like really deep, dense communities. The way that I define community is, or the way that I kind of like filter for the kind of communities that I think are worth going after, is basically when you can walk into it and your voice and you say something no one hears, right? It's like screaming in space. But if you go on like let's say the fitness subreddit on Reddit and you create a post, it's sort of treated the same as effectively everybody else's post. Everybody sees that. It doesn't matter if you joined yesterday or you joined, or you're a moderator or what have you. You sort of have relatively the same sort of like sort of weight. Everything that you say sort of has the same weight, and that's kind of how I sort of really kind of try to delineate like the network and the community. And I saw this play out at Pinterest where I worked before Gumroad, where we started out as a community and we sort of transitioned to a network, right? Where if you joined Pinterest in the early days, you said something, you posted something, everybody on Pinterest would see it. That does not scale. And so pretty quickly people sort of like, we built the follow graph, we removed the everything feed, and we built an algorithm and all these kind of things. And so Pinterest was a phenomenal place for people to sort of build their communities in the early days, and it became a pretty terrible place now. I would never recommend it today. I would say communities like subreddits, forums that you can find on the internet, are much, much better places to get started. I personally got started on Hacker News, which was kind of like the water cooler chat of startups and the startup industry. And that really like sort of bolstered my bootstrapped, I guess, my sort of like networking in Silicon Valley before I got there. And that changes over time as you build an audience and you get followers on Twitter and these other platforms. Those things do sort of like become flywheels and grow faster and faster and faster, but they have this 0 to 1 sort of starting problem where you're only interesting on Twitter if you're interesting somewhere else. You kind of have to like import the interestingness of yourself from somewhere else, which for me was Hacker News. So I really like this rule. I've talked to so many people about how to sort of get started. People ask me all the time, like, how do I tweet, for example, or something like that? And why should I tweet? And like a lot of people also, I think, are scared. Like they're like, this is so easy. It's so easy to tweet. Like there's just so much competition. Like how do I really stand out from the crowd and build an audience? And there's this sort of like internet rule that's been around since like the 90s, I think, where effectively 1% of people actually create content, 9% comment, curate, contribute in some way that isn't sort of like original content creation. And then the rest, the 90%, just consume, right? They just lurk. And sort of people have tried to prove this is obviously a heuristic. It's not perfect, but people have seen this sort of play out on Reddit, Pinterest, YouTube, Twitter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You often have sort of like a very, very, very small group of people producing original content. You have like sort of like a 10x larger group of people that are sort of chiming in with their thoughts, commenting, curating, upvoting, downvoting. They're sort of like adding metadata to that original data. And then the vast majority of people, sort of a 10x multiple on that, are just there to consume, right? They're just there to just like absorb, and they don't even make themselves known. You don't even know that they're there. You might even liken this to like a music festival where you have like the sort of people on stage, then you have all of the sort of auxiliary things happening, which are sort of like 10x that, like all the food carts and the art sort of stuff and all of that kind of stuff. But then the vast majority of people are just there to consume the content. And my guess is it would actually be kind of pretty similar in ratio to the 1:990. And I think the really important thing about the 1:9:90 is if you look at the ratio between creation and consumption, it's 90, right? Like there's, for every one person who's creating content, there's 90 people who are consuming content. And so, and you don't have to go straight to creating. You can go from consuming to contributing and creating, which is sort of the path that most people do. But it's a massive, like if you just start creating content on the internet, you're literally sort of upping your table stakes by 90x, right? It's for everything you say, there are probably 90 or so at least people paying attention, and certainly that ratio actually grows over time. Like everything that I put on Twitter gets seen by over 100,000 people, sometimes 500 to a million people if it goes viral or whatever. But that starts with figuring out like, okay, what is the structure of this network? And how do I benefit from it? And the easiest way to create leverage is to just do the thing that most people don't do, which is create genuinely unique content. I mean, the reason that you're listening to me today is because I created some content and put it on the internet that a lot of people consumed, right? And that's not easy. Creation is sort of like a very hard thing, stressful and difficult and expensive and time consuming, but the truth is that's also why people don't do it. So if you're willing to do it, if you're willing to put in the effort, you can sort of basically you create a beacon for all of the people that are going to be interested in what you're going to build, right? Like if I shipped a new product tomorrow for creators or founders or anybody else, there's just all of these people who've spent years listening to what I have to say, kind of have a mental model for the way that I think and sort of the things that I care about. The things that I care about are probably going to lead to like some alignment on the way that we sort of both think a problem should be solved. And so, if I tweeted tomorrow, hey, I have this new product, for creators, like I would probably get, 10 to 50,000 people signing up, I would assume within the first 24 hours, because there's there's all these people who already have trust in what I'm doing, which is more than most startups could do with teams. And it's because I spent so long, building the audience, finding my communities. And it's also because most people don't do that, right? And it doesn't really matter how many people I like tell this kind of stuff to. The truth is most people will still not do it, which is why, which is great for me. Like that's great. That's more cake for me. And I've seen this like in every vertical, like Gumroad. One of the really fun things about it is I can, I live in sort of Hollywood sometimes, oil painting, animation, fitness, wellness, spirituality, weird voodoo stuff people do over there. Stand-up comedy, documentaries, like every music, every type of content people sell, we help people sell it. And so I've sort of seen this play out over and over and over again, where like if you think about the people in each of these verticals that that you follow, that would, if they launched a product, you'd hear about it. It's often the sort of 1% that's creating a lot of the content, right? It's the people who sort of like share their weight loss journey or talk about their journey getting into Hollywood or like have behind the scenes footage. It's not the best necessarily. It's the people that that are really taking the time to create all of this content and share their lives with you. And this is the only real way also, I think, to find your voice. I think the other problem with this, I think people have, is they don't know what to say, right? They say it like, I don't know. The internet is kind of this permanent record, and people, will sort of like, what do I stand for? And like, you have to pick something and then you have to sort of like stand by it. And that's just not really true. Like you can kind of just start with something and you can launch a product and you can change what that product does, but you're not going to learn until you start shipping, right? In this case, you're just shipping words instead of lines of code or something like that. And it really is important, I think, to start shipping early and often. And I have this great quote from Nathan Barry from ConvertKit. And he has this post he wrote a long time ago, where so I'll just read it out. It's about this guy, Chris Kohler, who does the CSS tricks. So Nathan says, I realized that I would take on a project, do the work, deliver the project, and move on. Chris did the same thing, but before he moved on, he would teach about everything he learned about doing that project. When he could, he shared examples, wrote tutorials, and any specific methods he went through. He did this with every project. The difference was that all along the way, Teach was everything. Chris was teaching everything he knew, and I wasn't. So Nathan had basically effectively done the same thing that Chris was doing, but Chris was actually had a blog, and sort of as part of his workflow would sort of take all the stuff that he'd learned and do a little blog post about it. And by the time he did this Kickstarter, he was able to like just blow it out of the water. There were all these people who wanted to support him and transition from being readers of his blog to supporters, financial supporters of his. And so that's like the best sort of easiest hack is you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be in the top 1%. You just have to be slightly ahead of other folks and be willing to kind of share your learnings along the way. And I still do that. Like I'm learning stuff all the time. Like I just started, I'm raising this little micro VC fund right now, and I've learned a ton of stuff. And like my marketing strategy for the fund already, and will continue to be like, what have I learned from this process? And I don't want to tell anyone that I know what I'm doing. There's certainly way more people who are experienced, but there's this sort of curse of knowledge, right? Where like when you know something and when you're so good at something, kind of like that Gumroad story, like I got really good at telling a certain story that like, it's actually just not the right thing for beginners to hear sometimes, right? Like it's actually sometimes better to get advice from people who are just like 1 or 2 steps ahead of you than people who did this thing and succeeded like 10 years ago. The world changes so fast. That I think there's you don't have to be an expert. I actually think it's like bad if you're an expert. Like if you could watch like Leonardo da Vinci paint, you would probably learn nothing, to be honest. But if you watch someone who's just like a year ahead of you in school paint, you'll learn a lot because you can kind of see the gap between where you are and where they are, and you can kind of like you can close the gap over time. But I don't know if you've ever read like just a phenomenal book, and it's just demotivating. Right? It's just like, okay, cool. Like, I have no idea how I'm ever going to write like this. I didn't even know words like this existed in the English language. It's way better to actually read. Like, I feel like like I have a writing group and I read like work from my peers, many of whom are better than me. And it's so much more productive because I can actually like learn and grow through that. So that's sort of like a big takeaway. I think that I really want to highlight is you don't have to be like really good to become a pillar. You just have to be good enough, and you have to be willing to put yourself out there. And over time, you will sort of become a pillar in this community that you've chosen. And that might mean different things to sort of different communities. Like I feel like I'm a sort of quote unquote pillar in this sort of startup ecosystem now. If I say something, a lot of people pay attention. That might mean you're a moderator on the fitness subreddit. Or leading Creative Bridge or whatever. Like there's all these different forums, but I just think it means contributing in a meaningful way where people in the community are basically coming to you for advice. They're saying, hey, I have a problem. Can you help me solve it? Which, going back to the make something people want or make something people need, like that's a pretty important part of building a business. And so if you can get to that point where you're starting to get to that sort of like people literally, one, they're telling you problems, that's really nice, but two, they're saying like they want you to be the one to solve their problem for them. I think that's sort of like a really, really great place to be, right? Most businesses, I don't know, you can see all these studies, who knows like how legit they are, but there's a lot of data I think that shows that like, I mean, the number one reason businesses fail is because they don't actually solve a problem. Like they literally die with 0 customers. Like they never got to a single one, right? And so like the best way to solve the problem is to like have those people sort of line up the door, at the door before you open, right? Metaphorically. The other thing that it lets you do, a friend of mine who's a Gumroad creator, he has this great chart. And the red is software businesses. The green are sort of books, courses, videos, the kind of stuff that you'd sell on Gumroad or some of these other platforms. And then sort of like the blue line at the bottom is freelancing, is like service work effectively. And I really like this because I think it sort of shows obviously the sort of financial differences between these things, but it also shows like the time scale, right? Like it takes a long time for a software business, the kind of businesses that Gumroad is, and that sort of the businesses that I do recommend a lot of people do build. over time, it takes a long, long, long time, right? Like you saw that chart in the beginning of Gumroad, it took a long time, years and years and years to get to significant scale where maybe even like one person's full-time salary in San Francisco could be paid by Gumroad. It takes a long time. And so the other really nice thing about becoming a pillar in the community is you can actually start monetizing in a way that gets you a living earlier, right? You don't have to actually sort of get to the productized, the service, the productized service or the product right away. You can sort of do that over time, and as you need to, you can freelance, you can start doing these product launches, you can sort of supplement your income in a way to kind of like help you stay solvent until that software business that you built, which ultimately has way more leverage. So like, years from now, like there's no way I could do any product launch or any service billing work that would ever get close to how much money Gumroad does on a daily basis. But it takes a long, long, long time to do that, right? And so I think that's sort of like the other sort of very, I think, sort of, it makes it much more realistic is you can sort of transition to this over time. And so, and this is sort of like leads really nicely, I think, into figuring out what you want to build. Because effectively, in my opinion, basically almost every product is actually just like a version of a service, right? You kind of start with a manual service, which is like, let's say someone's like, hey, I want to sell a product on the internet, just use Gumroad. I could go build them a website. I could go like design it for them. We could like sit together and talk and build this thing together and design it and all these things, and set it up with Stripe and MailChimp and all of the kind of the tech stack that they would need. And I would charge them like a fixed fee for that, right? It's kind of going back to the freelancing or the freelancing line. And then I could write a book about it saying, hey, this is how I would actually go out and do it, right? This is, it's a $50 ebook or something like that. And this is exactly how I would sort of like take your product and create a page and do all of these kind of things. And over that process, you're actually learning like what are the similarities, what are the problems that every single person has, what are the places that differ, and over time you can sort of build a mental model of like basically the product that you would ship to solve this problem at scale, and it just, I think, really makes it much more obvious and clear the kind of product you should be building. Because you're no longer like just like building the product to solve the problem. You've already solved the problem for these people, right? You've just solved it in like a very inefficient way. And so now you're just sort of like adding leverage to that, and you're just sort of trying to make it faster and faster and faster so that eventually it becomes a self-serve product where people can go just sign up and get started and pay you. And they never have to talk to you one-on-one, which is the goal, but it can take a lot of time. And I think a lot of people just skip all of this stuff, right? They skip the community, they skip all this stuff. They just say, hey, I need to go build a product. This is the product I'm going to build for restaurants or for bands or for concert venues. But the sort of like the learning process of this, I think, is so key. And you can certainly do all of this stuff, and you will have to do all this stuff after you get started as a company. But at that point, you're already burning all of this capital. You're sort of like the clock is ticking, right? And so you can kind of start this process, I feel like, way earlier, so that when you actually launch the company, you're sort of like, you have a running start. You're kind of doing great from the beginning. And I feel like a lot of overnight successes that you see are actually this in disguise. It's just like the launch happens here or something like that, but they've actually been like doing this kind of cycle for a long time, right? I mean, Basecamp, a sort of very famous company in the ecosystem, it basically did this, where they started out as a design firm, and they would literally do product management for their clients. And over time, they would sort of automate certain processes and scale themselves. And then they ship Basecamp, which is, probably makes tens of millions, if not over $100 million a year in revenue. I have a cat too, by the way, so she might get in the way. I don't know. Does anyone have any questions about all this? I'm just blabbing.
No, it's great. Does anyone have any questions just now?
Yeah, I do, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Sahil, thank you so much. That was it's really amazing. It's so great to hear from people of your caliber and hear you talk about these things with such humility. So thanks very, very much for being here. I've got a quick question around that kind of paradigm of saying, hey, I'm delivering a service for a while, I'm learning the ropes, and over time, I can turn that into a product. And I totally agree with you, and that's actually the kind of overnight success is often those people. I think there's maybe a kind of trodden path for a kind of B2B consultant type person doing that. Is there any way you could maybe go into a little bit what it's like for creatives? Because I think maybe the trodden path of, I don't know, like I'm a consultant and I see an accountant do a thing with a spreadsheet and I help them do it and then I build a little tool around it and then I sell it, is maybe more obvious than I'm a creative and sometimes creative work or service stuff seems more special or magical or something. And less apt to become a product. Maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, totally. I think you're right. I think when you are solving a business use case, it's just much easier to evaluate, right? Because you're sort of very clearly solving the problem that they have, and it's very measurable, which is typically like money related, right? So it's like if this thing costs $20 or 20 minutes, then I can make it cost $10 or 10 minutes. Guess what? I can charge $10 for this product or service, right? And that you see that in startups over and over and over again. And the vast majority of startups are B2B, right? Like the way that I should have an image about this because I've never seen it, but I think the economy is sort of like, let's say it's a circle, and consumers are on the edge, right? Like they're on the sort of circumference, perimeter, or whatever. It's been a long time since geometry in high school or middle school. And then inside that circle are like all of these businesses, right? So you're actually only interfacing with like a tiny fraction of the businesses, right? You're interfacing with Facebook and like all these consumer startups, but like Facebook probably has relationships with, I guess it's literally thousands and thousands of businesses to do all of these sort of things. And a lot of those businesses interface. So there's like all of this stuff, like all these connections, but you only see and so that's, I think a big part is like, it's interesting when I sort of like, I'm talking about a lot of this stuff. Like a lot of people are like, oh, this is like really sort of like specific. You're only talking about a small group of businesses, but actually I think it's like the vast majority of businesses. I think if you're, and I've seen that with my own investing and things like that, like the vast majority of companies are sort of B2B businesses, right? They're selling businesses. But I guess to answer your question more directly, the trodden path, the sort of, if I had to kind of come up with like the one-to-one analogy here, it would be teaching people how to create the way that you're creating, right? So if you're a musician, it's teaching the sort of next generation of musicians like how you actually make music or produce content. That's sort of like, in my mind, the kind of the same thing, which is you take a problem that you had and you ended up solving it, typically manually by, like learning the skills, and then you productize it and you kind of build a product that allows other people to solve that problem for themselves much faster than you were able to. So for example, I have a friend, Brian Mark Taylor. He's an oil painter. He does these amazing landscapes, definitely worth following on Instagram. And he was on some plein air trip, like, I don't know, this is at this point probably years and years ago, 10 years ago or something. And his easel that he had, so plein air painting, right, is you basically take all your materials with you on site and you go paint like a mountain or whatever, which I like to do in my free time. And his easel broke, which basically means he's not able to do this. And so he basically went home and sort of solved the problem. He like built his own easel, and now it's like one of the top selling easels. And he already had the audience because he was posting his paintings and stuff on Instagram all the time. So he's now, basically like almost immediately had a successful business out of the gate. So that's like sort of like one option, is to sort of like figure out what problems you're solving. And then the other one is just education. It's just like literally teaching people how to paint, how to do music, how to produce, how to do, how to sing, how to do yoga. That's a lot of the content that we see on Gumroad is sort of like the sort of like the in-between of that, which is, it's just the productized service, right? It's just like taking the thing that they were doing one-on-one with clients and sort of scaling that up so they could sort of effectively charge like $1,000 hourly rate instead of $100 hourly rate. And then eventually they can sort of figure out, okay, is there something deeper here? Can I build a software offering here? Sometimes the answer is no, right? Sometimes the answer is like, the truth is like, going back to that sort of community problem, one of the sort of key parts is picking, it's often a subset of that community that you're building for. You want to make sure that you're building for, frankly, a group of people that have money and are willing to pay you money for the thing that you're building, right? Because there are a lot of people who are like, yeah, I really want to build, you know, a startup that helps this group of people. And I'm like, look, great. That group of people is tiny and doesn't have a lot of money, right? They're sort of very price elastic, or price inelastic or whatever. So just know that going in, right? Like if you ultimately you want to build a business, like it's not charity. You're sort of, you know, it is sort of a business decision that you need to make. I think the next slide, awesome, yes. So I guess to jump off from that, or let me talk about this really quick. So Clayton Christensen, he just passed away actually, but he's sort of one of the sort of like perennial thinkers now in business, and like I feel like his work is going to be, out there for a long time. But he created this framework called the job to be done, I believe, framework, which is basically every single problem and every single solution can really be framed like a job that needs to get done. And so he uses this example of like a McDonald's milkshake, because it seems like the most absurd, I guess, example of like, is there like what problem is like a McDonald's milkshake solving for people? And there is actually a job that this thing solves. So he says somewhere out there's a job that arises in the lives of some people sometimes that causes them to hire a milkshake. And I really like that phrase, like hire a milkshake, just like you would hire a carpenter. And they did a bunch of research on this. I think McDonald's literally paid him and his team to figure out like why are people buying our milkshakes, because we want to tell more people that they have this problem or this job that they need to hire a milkshake for. And they found out that that half of the milkshakes were sold before 8:30 in the morning. Half of McDonald's milkshakes were sold before 8:30 in the morning, which, at least in my mind, this blows my mind. Like, I don't understand why you want a milkshake at 8:30 in the morning. And I don't know if people want to guess. I can't read the chat in this mode, but I'm curious if anyone guesses the reason. The reason is, I'll give you a hint, which is McDonald's milkshakes are incredibly viscous. Don't worry, I'm just looking at my notes. I'm not looking at Twitter. They're super, super viscous. Yeah, okay. I'll say now. That's enough time to guess. The reason is, basically, I'll give you a couple more data points. Besides, they were sold before 8:30 in the morning. It was the only thing that they bought. They were always alone, and they were always sort of, it was like drive-through. They were always kind of in a car. Basically, the problem that the job to be done was to accompany a lonely driver on their trip to work, which is why the milkshakes are so viscous, so that it lasts the whole car ride. And that's kind of crazy to me. And I don't actually recommend it. Like, I don't recommend hiring a milkshake. I don't think that's good for the society too often. I'm sure their sort of repeat customer data was also pretty scary to look at. But I'm sure this data was probably in America. But this is like a different approach, right? McDonald's approach is to basically convince people that they have this problem, to be honest, right? It's spending hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising to convince them that they actually do need a milkshake. And I don't think that's the approach. That's sort of like the traditional, like that's like the VC back thing, right? It's like make a mattress and then go convince a bunch of people that they have sleep problems and that they need this stuff. It's much more effective, I think, to become a pillar in the community and to sort of just like listen to the problems that people already have. I don't think it's sort of super healthy for society to kind of like create more problems. I think people already have enough of those, in my opinion. This is sort of economics 101, kind of stuff, but I think it's like a really useful sort of fundamental framework for like figuring out what you should be building, which is there's basically only four kinds of utility and effectively that's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to create utility, right, for these group of people. One is place utility, one is form utility, one is time, and one is possession. So you're basically changing the form of something in order to make it more useful, right? So you're moving it somewhere that it wasn't, which might be like, Amazon actually kind of solves all these problems, which is why it's $1 trillion company. You're taking a bunch of stuff and you're reformatting it, which is kind of like what a musician might be doing or something like that. You're taking something that used to take a really long time, you're making it take a really short time. A lot of that kind of like AI automation stuff is around this kind of stuff. And then position utility, which is you're basically just making it possible to even have the thing in the first place. You're getting rid of the middleman, like Gumroad might have gotten rid of, the label for certain musicians or something like that. And so this is like a really helpful framework, I think. The sort of like the kind of the chart that I like to make is like the people that have problems that I want to help. It might be me, it might be painters, it might be musicians, it might be, I don't know, people who want to lose weight or what have you. Then there's like the activity that they kind of like the thing that they want to go out and do, which might be driving to work in the milkshake case or whatever, painting, plein air painting in the hobby, in the painting case. And then with that, you can figure out, okay, well, what are some of the problems? Like, what are the things that are too inaccessible, too difficult, too slow, too expensive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and really try to figure out like what that is, right? So for example, when I learned to paint, one problem I had was like, I don't know what colors to buy. Like I went into the art store, I spent, I don't know, weeks or months, like being like, what do I actually need to buy to like learn how to paint? I don't even know. Which might be time utility. You could have written a blog post, right? That would have been great content marketing and just told me like, these are the 3 colors, but guess what? It's red, yellow, and blue. Who knew? Red, yellow, blue, and white, I think, are the colors you should start out with. But just like consolidating that information would have created a lot of time utility for me. And so that's sort of, in my opinion, this is like a really great simple framework of just making sure like what you're building has utility, but then also like it breaks it down a little bit, where if you've already really figured out the community aspect and you're having trouble like figuring out the problem that you want to solve, the product you want to build, it's like really like these dimensions I think are really, really helpful for me to think through that. I already talked about this, but it really does matter. Like the type of folks you build for, the kind of problem that you solve for them. There's certain problems that just aren't that big, and there are other problems that are absolutely massive. And it is sort of like the quintessential, VCs call it the total addressable market, but it does matter a lot. It does matter, like the kind of thing that you build is sort of like the total size of the pie, and you're only going to be able to get a certain part of that. So wow, it's already been an hour. But let me kind of summarize, and then we can go to Q&A or take a break or whatever the next thing is on the agenda. Every single business starts with the people you want to build for, right? Ultimately, like that's why you exist as a business, is to serve people and to solve some people's problems for them. And I think it's much, much healthier to start that way. Start with the community, figure out the problem, figure out the product, and then finally figure out the business model for that product and the business itself. It kind of starts there and grows from there. And the way that you the way that you solve the problem, the way that the people you hire, the folks you raise money from, how much money you raise, who you want on your team, like all of these things really stem, I think, from like who is the community and what is the problem. Like they're totally different people I would have chosen to work with if I wanted to solve a different problem, right? And so I think when you start too much with the business and the product side of things, I think you're making a lot of bad decisions. You're probably going to have to revisit. I also think it's really important to figure out the kind of people you want to serve. Ultimately, if you pick a problem and a community, you're going to spend a lot of your time. I'm in the creative kind of spheres, and I'm glad that I like it. But I spend like a good chunk of my time for the last 10 years and probably for the next 10 years talking to creators, and so like make sure that you're really sort of excited about spending a lot of time with these people, right? Like if you're excited about helping people who have, are lonely on their drive to work, like you might want to sort of go work at McDonald's or whatever. picking the right problem is also super essential. I didn't really get into this just because I think like so many people cover that kind of Y Combinator makes something people want. But I guess the nuance here is to pick the right people in the community to build for. There's, you know, like even if you look at, I don't know, a music festival, there's sort of like the 10% that have a ton of disposable income and the 90% that don't have a ton of disposable income. And obviously you want to serve everybody, and it's not the goal to just build stuff for rich people. But if you look at the way it often happens, you don't have economies of scale at the beginning, right? So you might want to pick the people who are going to be able to pay you the most money at first. And then as you grow, you can sort of like subsidize your product and go from the Tesla Roadster to the S to the E to the whatever the different the three, I guess. But the other products that they have, or Apple, you know, kind of has gone down the market a little bit as well. Uber started with black cards, etc. But yeah, I think it really is all about community. It's kind of a buzzword now. So I promise I started thinking about the stuff before it became a buzzword. But it really is about community. I think if you think about all the other stuff that a business has to do, marketing, sales, hiring, legal operations, like I feel like the way I hire is to talk to my community. The best people are in the community. The way that the marketing is all through the community. The way that we get feedback on the product is through the community. You know, like it becomes just really sort of like useful way to build a business. There's like an African proverb that'll end with is it takes a village to raise a child, right? Like that's sort of like a pretty famous line. And I think the sort of same applies to building a business, except you replace, you know, child with business and maybe village with community. But ultimately, like, you're not going to build a business solo, right? You're going to need a lot of people. They don't all have to be employed within your company, but there's going to be a whole collective of people that are going to help you actually build this thing. They're going to want you to build this thing, which is why they're helping you do it. They're going to help you do it because they've seen you kind of serve this community one-on-one, manually creating all this content and teaching people, etc. But no one builds a business, I think, by themselves. Like, I think it does take like a collective, many people to do this, mostly unpaid. They're doing it because they want to help you succeed. And so really, I think it's sort of so fundamentally important. And all of the other stuff, like the marketing stuff, the building stuff, like, I think that stuff it's obviously hard. It's not easy to do any of these other things, but it's much more deterministic. It's like, if you have the community, if you have a clear problem, if people want you to build this thing, actually building the stuff, it sort of becomes an execution risk problem. Marketing, all of that kind of stuff, I think becomes so much easier if you have this early stuff in place. Like, you know, there's sort of like the timeline of a business is like maybe 10-20% spent on community and then like 80% spent on all this other stuff. But I think the sort of risk factors are 80% are in the community and that's early stage, and then like 20% are in this other stuff, because these things are sort of like are you know, shared across all kind of businesses, right? You can always hire a lawyer, you can always sort of hire a marketer, you can always figure this stuff out. So like, I think it's really worth focusing on this other stuff. And then when you get to this point, you already have a business, it's already growing, working, you're going to have like a long list of people who are going to want to help you solve those problems. And you know, it's really, I think, worth really like investigating like this kind of the hard stuff here, making sure you're building the right kind of business, doing all the creative decision making, sort of like outlining the book per se. And then it just becomes an implementation game, which is a very learnable thing that many people have done. You can pay for those things, et cetera. Yeah, I just wanted to plug myself. If you're interested in my thoughts, or my short form thoughts or my long form thoughts, these are kind of like the two best places to find me on the internet. And that's all I have to say.